The chill of Anhua was unlike any Ha had known, a cold that seeped not just into her bones, but seemed to pluck at the very threads of her resolve. 40 kilometers from the city's ceaseless hum, this small town clung to a quiet despair, its edges frayed by time and rumor. Tonight, though, the rumors were her bread and butter, her journalistic quarry. Her editor, a man who saw ratings in every whisper of the spectral, had tasked her with a headline piece, "The Last Night at the Town Cemetery." And Ha, with her insatiable curiosity and a penchant for the unexplainable, had eagerly accepted the assignment. She had to be there, to see it, to feel it, to capture the essence of a place on the brink of erasure. The town's only cemetery, an ancient sentinel of stone and sorrow, lay on the far fringe, a place whispered about in hushed tones even in broad daylight. More than a century old, it was said to hold the forgotten souls of a long-past epidemic, its earth a patchwork of unmarked graves and weather-beaten monuments. The locals spoke of the 13th lunar night with particular dread, a time when the veil between worlds thinned. Footsteps on dry leaves, the phantom scent of burning incense, and fleeting shadows flitting behind crumbling headstones. These were the tales that fueled Anhua's deepest fears. Tonight was precisely that night, the last one, before bulldozers claimed the land for a new housing development, forever silencing whatever secrets lay beneath. Ha parked her scooter a short distance from the cemetery's wrought iron gates, their hinges groaning in the subtle breeze. It was just past 8 p.m., the sky an inky canvas punctured by a handful of shy stars. A thick, pearlescent fog had begun to roll in, swallowing the distant streetlights and muffling the already subdued sounds of the town.
Her breath plumed in the frigid air, and she pulled her jacket tighter, adjusting the strap of her camera bag on her shoulder. Her trusty flashlight, its beam a hesitant flicker, seemed to share her trepidation, dancing nervously against the encroaching gloom. As she pushed open one of the massive gates, a metallic screech echoed eerily through the silence, making the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. The air inside felt immediately heavier, colder, laden with the scent of damp earth and something else, something subtly sweet and ancient, like fading memories. Her gaze fell to the ground, just inside the threshold. Small, dark fragments of ash littered the compacted soil, as if a quiet, somber fire had recently been kindled there. Who would be burning anything here on a night like this, knowing the cemetery's fate? It was an odd detail, a small deviation from her expectations that pricked at her journalist's instincts.
Then, a delicate, almost ethereal sound drifted through the fog, the faint, crystalline chime of a wind bell. Half rose, her head tilting, listening intently. There were no houses nearby, no other structures from which such a sound could emanate. The nearest dwelling was at least a kilometer away, beyond the reach of any subtle breeze carrying such a gentle melody. It was impossible, yet it was undeniably there, a solitary note of melancholic music in the vast, desolate space. Her heart gave a sudden, unfamiliar lurch, a quick, sharp beat against her ribs. A peculiar sensation began to creep over her, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck. It was the distinct, unsettling feeling of being watched, an invisible gaze following her every tentative movement. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the silent, spectral landscape of leaning headstones and gnarled trees, their skeletal branches reaching like grasping fingers. Nothing. Only the swirling mist, the skeletal trees, and the silent, stony faces of the graves. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly, consciously willing her pulse to return to its normal rhythm. It's just your mind playing tricks, Ha. she whispered to herself, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the dense fog. The power of suggestion, the perfect atmosphere, that's all it is. Yet the words felt hollow even to her own ears, a flimsy shield against an encroaching reality that felt anything but psychological. This was, after all, exactly what she had come for. Ha forced herself to refocus, shaking off the lingering sensation of unseen eyes. This was work, after all, and she had a story to capture. With a professional determination she didn't quite feel, she began her methodical survey, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom like a hesitant sword.
She moved slowly, carefully, her boots crunching softly on the scattered gravel paths and dry leaves that carpeted the ground. Each click of her camera shutter, each flash, felt like an intrusion, a brief, sharp noise in the oppressive silence. She documented the dates, the faded inscriptions, the crumbling angels and weeping willows carved into the stone, noting the pervasive sense of neglect that only added to the cemetery's eerie charm. The older sections, she observed, were a labyrinth of uneven ground and overgrown thickets, where ivy clung stubbornly to decaying marble. The newer plots, few and far between, stood starker, their modern granite gleaming faintly under her light. She noted the small, humble offerings left on some graves, a faded plastic flower, a single coin, a half-burnt stick of incense, tokens of remembrance that seemed poignant in the face of the imminent destruction.
The air grew colder with each passing minute, the fog thickening into an opaque, swirling shroud that made distant headstones appear and disappear like ghostly sentinels. As she delved deeper into the cemetery's heart, a particular section drew her attention. It was set apart, almost deliberately isolated, tucked away behind a dense clump of ancient banyan trees whose roots snaked across the ground like petrified serpents. The path leading to it was barely discernible, choked with thorny bushes and tall, dry grass. A peculiar silence hung over this area, even heavier than elsewhere, as if the very air itself held its breath. It felt different, unmarked, unvisited. Pushing through the thorny barrier, Ha found herself in a small clearing. Here the ground was strangely barren, almost barren of grass. 5 simple, unadorned tombstones stood in a tight semicircle, utterly devoid of names or dates. No ornate carvings, no epitaphs, just raw, unpolished stone.
Her flashlight beam, now steadier, picked out a single, repeated inscription etched into the face of each monument. 23. Roman numerals. 23. 5 identical markers, identical symbols, standing in silent, stark uniformity. It was a stark contrast to the flamboyant, varied designs of the other graves she had seen, a peculiar anonymity that spoke volumes. Intrigued, Ha reached out, her fingers hesitant, to touch the surface of the nearest stone. The moment her skin made contact, a shock ran through her. The stone was not merely cold, it was unnaturally, piercingly frigid, with a smooth, dense feel that reminded her less of granite and more of some unknown metal, an alien chill that seemed to draw the warmth from her very being. She quickly pulled her hand back, rubbing her fingers, a shiver chasing its way down her spine. These weren't ordinary graves. Nothing about them felt ordinary. Lost in her thoughts, examining the strange markers, Ha didn't notice the precise passage of time until the moon, now a pale, obscure disk, was high overhead. She glanced at her watch, almost 11 p.m. The fog had become a dense, impenetrable wall around her, shrinking her world to the small circle illuminated by her flashlight. It was then a whisper,
so faint it could have been merely the wind coiled around her ears. Don't destroy this place." The voice was soft, fragile, yet resonated with an unmistakable urgency, cutting through the silence like a razor's edge. It seemed to come from directly behind the XXII graves. Ha spun around, her heart thudding violently against her ribs, her flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the dense fog, searching for a source, a person, anything. But there was nothing, only the swirling mist, silent and empty. Yet, as she stood there, straining her ears, the air around the unnamed graves grew perceptibly colder, the temperature dropping with an alarming suddenness, a biting chill that made her teeth chatter involuntarily. The fog in this immediate vicinity also seemed to thicken, swirling into denser, more opaque eddies, as if intentionally obscuring something from her sight. As she continued to search, her light grazed a small, almost invisible crevice in a large moss-covered rock near the base of the nearest 23 grave. Something tucked deep inside caught her eye. It was a small, ancient notebook, its leather cover cracked and peeling, its pages swollen and mottled with dampness and age. With trembling fingers, Ha carefully extricated it, the brittle paper threatening to disintegrate at her touch. It felt incredibly old, fragile, a relic. The faint inscription on the cover was barely legible. N.H. Nuigak Niachang, Mochin Baihai, the cemetery caretaker. She carefully opened the book, the pages rustling like dry leaves. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, yet increasingly frantic towards the later entries. She began to read, her eyes wide, tracing the faded ink in the beam of her flashlight. The early entries spoke of mundane tasks, grave maintenance, but then the tone shifted. A section, specifically about the 5 nameless graves, sent a cold spike of dread through her. "The 5 in section 23 are not to be buried by name," the caretaker had written. "They are the ones who must remain forgotten, erased. They died in an event the town decided to bury, a secret too terrible to speak aloud." Ha's breath hitched. A hidden event? What could be so awful? She read on, her eyes darting across the brittle page. "Every 23 years, on the 13th lunar night, they awaken. My duty, and the duty of those before me, is to ensure they never leave this consecrated ground, to keep them contained." The words blurred before her eyes, a chilling revelation. She flipped to the very last page, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped the book. The final entry, scrawled in a desperate, almost illegible hand, was dated October 13th, 1972. It read, "They are awake. I cannot hold them anymore." The caretaker's final words echoed in Ha's mind, a cold, desperate plea from the past that now resonated with terrifying clarity. Her flashlight beam, clutched tight in her trembling hand, illuminated the faded ink, the frantic urgency bleeding through the paper. "They are awake. I cannot hold them anymore." The date, October 13th, 1972. It was the 13th lunar night, exactly 51 years ago. A shiver, colder than the surrounding fog, traced a path up her spine. This wasn't just a local legend. This was a recorded, documented, terrifying reality. The cryptic message about the town burying a secret, the 5 nameless graves, the chilling touch of the stone, the phantom voice, the sudden drop in temperature. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. She wasn't merely observing, she was witnessing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence. She looked from the ancient, disintegrating journal to the 5 stark, unadorned headstones, then back to the words. The caretaker had believed this. He had lived this. and he had failed. The implications were staggering, a chilling narrative far more sinister than any ghost story she had ever chased. This wasn't about restless spirits. It was about something actively contained, something that needed to be held, and something that on this very night was said to awaken. Her journalistic curiosity, usually her driving force, was rapidly giving way to a primal fear.
Ha instinctively backed away from the 23 graves, her footfalls silent on the damp earth. She clutched the journal to her chest, its brittle pages pressing against her as if offering a perverse comfort, a tangible link to a truth she desperately wished to disbelieve. Her gaze swept over the banyan trees, their dark forms now seeming more menacing, their intertwined roots resembling tangled limbs striving to break free from the earth. The fog, denser than ever, pressed in around her, a suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all sound, all light, all hope. She decided, with a sudden, overwhelming urge, that she had seen enough. This was no longer a story to report. It was a warning. The cemetery, once a morbidly fascinating subject, had become a living, breathing threat. She needed to get out, to process this information in the safety of her apartment, under the reassuring glow of electric lights. She needed to tell someone, anyone, about the journal, about the truth.
The demolition of the cemetery, once a simple act of urban development, now felt like a catastrophic error, a liberation of something truly terrible. Turning on her heel, Ha tried to retrace her steps, but the dense fog had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien maze. Every tree looked the same, every path seemed to lead nowhere. Panic began to claw at her throat, a cold, tight knot. Her flashlight beam, still flickering with an unnerving irregularity, struggled to pierce the thick white shroud, its light diffused and swallowed, offering little guidance. She walked faster, then faster still, her breathing growing ragged, each step propelling her further into the disorienting heart of the old graveyard. The faint chime of the wind bell, which she had heard upon entering, now seemed closer, more insistent, a mocking melody carried on the chilled air. It wasn't the sweet, melancholic sound she'd heard before. It was sharp, brittle, like tiny shards of ice clinking together.
And then, subtly, another sound began to emerge from the pervasive silence, a faint, rustling whisper, like dry leaves skittering across distant paths, but without the accompanying footfalls. It was the very sound the legend spoke of. Her journalistic mind, despite her fear, noted the detail, the rustling without the weight, the sound of movement without the movement itself. It was an auditory illusion, a trick of the mind in the oppressive quiet, she told herself. But the explanation offered no comfort. The whispers grew, coalescing into a faint, indecipherable murmur, as if many voices were speaking just beyond the edge of her hearing, carried on the frigid currents of the fog. Then she saw it, a shadow, long and impossibly thin, stretched across the face of a distant headstone. It was too elongated, too distorted to be natural, a grotesque caricature of a human form, wavering in the dense mist. It wasn't a trick of her flashlight. The beam hadn't even reached that far.
It was simply there, a dark smear against the white backdrop of the fog, then gone. Ha blinked, shook her head, trying to clear her vision, to convince herself it was merely the interplay of light and shadow, the deceptive nature of the swirling vapor. But then another appeared, closer this time, a dark, indistinct form lurking behind a cluster of 3 graves, barely visible through the swirling tendrils of mist. It seemed to sway, almost imperceptibly, as if observing her. She stopped dead in her tracks, every muscle in her body tensing. Her breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the journal, her knuckles white. She could feel the icy cold emanating from the direction of the shadow, a distinct drop in temperature, confirming that her senses were not deceiving her. The atmosphere was shifting, the supernatural elements of the caretaker's journal bleeding into her physical reality. This was no longer just a story. It was a terrifying, unfolding event.
The air grew heavy, thick with a palpable sense of dread. Ha stood frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her eyes wide, staring at the dark, elongated form that now seemed to materialize more distinctly from the fog. It was not a shadow cast by an unseen source, but a presence, a figure whose dimensions defied natural explanation. It swayed, almost imperceptibly, behind the gravestones, its silhouette tall and gaunt, like a scarecrow made of darkness, its limbs impossibly long and thin. No sound accompanied its eerie stillness, no rustle of fabric, no crunch of leaves. It simply was. Then another appeared, closer still, merging from the swirling mist between two ancient moss-covered monuments. And another, a third, further down what she now realized was the main path. They were indistinct, like ink blots smeared across the canvas of the fog, yet undeniably present.
They didn't move with the fluid grace of humans, but with a strange, jerky stillness, almost as if they were being pulled by unseen strings, or were merely apparitions flickering into existence. Her flashlight beam, now a desperate, erratic beacon, swept past them, but they remained unaffected, unperturbed, existing just beyond the edge of tangible reality. A cold wave washed over Ha, a paralyzing fear that locked her muscles. This was beyond anything her rational mind could comprehend, beyond any journalistic pursuit. These were not mere atmospheric effects, nor the tricks of a tired mind. These were the awake ones, the figures from the caretaker's desperate final entry, finally making their presence known. Her mind raced, grappling with the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing. The stories, the whispers, the journal, all of it was true. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt rooted to the cold, damp earth.
The wind bell, somewhere nearby, began to chime more frantically, a discordant, clanging sound that grated on her nerves, seeming to warn her, or perhaps to mock her. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of hushed voices, like dry leaves rustling across concrete, closer, surrounding her. She couldn't make out words, just the unsettling sibilance of unseen mouths breathing secrets into the frigid night. One of the figures, the closest one, began to move. It glided rather than walked across the short distance separating them, its unnaturally elongated form seeming to stretch and contract with each silent step. It stopped mere meters from her, its head tilted, an almost imperceptible movement that nonetheless conveyed a sense of malevolent attention. Ha could feel its gaze, a heavy, suffocating weight, even though she couldn't discern any features within its dark silhouette. And then it spoke.
The voice was a dry whisper, like sand sifting over stone, yet it resonated with an ancient power that vibrated through the very ground beneath her feet. It was not the fragile plea she had heard earlier near the 23rd graves. This voice was devoid of fragility, filled instead with a chilling, triumphant resolve. "The last night," it hissed, the words seeming to tear at the fabric of the air itself. "We will not be imprisoned any longer." Ha's blood ran cold, imprisoned. The word confirmed her deepest fears, solidifying the journal's cryptic entries. This cemetery was not merely a resting place, but a jail, and tonight the inmates were breaking free. Her mind screamed for action, for escape, but her body refused to obey, caught in the terrifying grip of utter disbelief and primal terror. The figure stood there, radiating an icy cold that seemed to suck the very warmth from her skin, from the air around them. The other figures, previously still, now also began to shift.
They drifted closer, slowly encircling her, their gaunt, distorted forms merging and separating with the swirling fog, like dancers in a macabre ballet. The whispers intensified, intertwining with the frantic chime of the wind bell, creating a symphony of dread that pressed in on her from all sides. She was trapped, a lone intruder, in a gathering of the undead, or something far worse. Then, from the direction of the 23rd graves, a deep, guttural sound reverberated through the ground, a low rumble that vibrated up through her feet and into her bones. Ruck, ruck, ruck. It sounded like ancient stone cracking, like earth tearing open. With a surge of adrenaline that finally broke through her paralysis, tore her gaze from the terrifying figures, and swung her flashlight towards the secluded clearing. What she saw made her gasp, a choked, strangled sound that died in her throat. The 5 stark, nameless tombstones of Section 23rd were no longer mere markers.
Deep, jagged cracks were spreading rapidly across their cold, metallic surfaces, spiderwebbing outwards from their bases. The earth around them was heaving, shifting, great clods of soil collapsing inwards as if something immense was pushing its way up from beneath. The ground was literally opening, revealing not dark earth, but a deeper, blacker void, a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the light from her beam. A sound, a low, rasping groan, like something ancient stirring from a long, tormented sleep, emanated from the gaping fissures. The air grew even colder, a freezing breath that carried with it the scent of churned earth and something metallic, something that clawed at the back of her throat. The 5 monuments, their surfaces now completely fractured, began to slowly tilt inwards, the ground beneath them liquefying into a churning mud. Whatever had been buried beneath those stones was now actively, forcefully clawing its way free.
The figures surrounding her seemed to brighten, their dark forms coalescing, sharpening at the edges as if drawing strength from the unfolding horror at the 23 graves. A silent, triumphant anticipation hung in the air. Han knew, with absolute certainty, that she had to run, now. Her life, her sanity depended on it. She pivoted, her muscles screaming with the effort, and bolted. But as she turned towards what she believed was the main gate, her blood ran cold once more. The familiar wrought iron gates, the boundary between the living and the dead, were gone. In their place, stretching into the endless swirling fog, was an unbroken expanse of gravestones, row upon row, receding into an infinite, terrifying distance. The cemetery had changed. The exit had vanished. She was truly, horrifyingly trapped. Despair, a crushing, suffocating weight, slammed into Ha. The sight of the endless rows of graves where the gate should have been stole the air from her lungs.
Panic, raw and unadulterated, ignited a frantic surge of adrenaline through her veins. This wasn't just a physical trap, it was a psychological one, a complete dismantling of her reality. The cemetery had twisted, reshaped itself into an infinite maze designed to ensnare. She was lost, truly and utterly lost, in a place that had chosen this night to reveal its darkest, most terrifying secrets. Behind her, the sounds from the 23 graves intensified.
a continuous, grinding rack, 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 punctuated by wet, slurping noises that made her stomach churn. The earth was not just opening, it was actively giving birth to something monstrous. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, charged with a malevolent presence. The figures, those elongated shadows, had closed in further, their whispers now a distinct guttural chorus that resonated in her very bones. They were no longer merely observing, they were herding her, pushing her deeper into the nightmare.
Ha ran, blindly, instinctively, her legs pumping with newfound strength fueled by terror. She scrambled over ancient crumbling headstones, tripped on gnarled roots, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly, creating grotesque dancing shadows that seemed to mock her futile escape attempt. Her breath tore in her throat, raw and burning. The cold was no longer just external. It had seeped into her core, chilling her from the inside out. Each desperate stride felt like she was running on broken glass, her body protesting, but her mind screamed louder, urging her forward. The endless grave stretched before her, a desolate, stony ocean. She could hear the whispers behind her, closer now, a chilling reminder of her pursuers. They moved with an impossible speed, silent as ghosts, yet their presence was overwhelmingly real, a suffocating pressure on her back. She risked a glance over her shoulder, her heart leaping into her throat.
They were still there, 5 elongated forms, their outlines clearer in the swirling fog, gliding effortlessly over the uneven terrain, their dark forms like predatory specters. In her desperation, her hand instinctively fumbled for the journal still clutched to her chest. Its brittle edges pressed against her, a tangible link to the truth, a desperate anchor in a world turned upside down. Her fingers, slick with cold sweat, found the page, the last page, the one with the caretaker's final, frantic entry. As she ran, stumbling, gasping, her eyes darted down, trying to make sense of the faded ink in the erratic beam of her flashlight. They are awake. I cannot hold them anymore. She had read that. She had understood that. But beneath that final desperate line, another appeared, scrawled in an even finer, almost invisible hand. A page she hadn't seen before. A page that hadn't been there before. Her mind recoiled. Had the journal changed?
Hawk had her terror-stricken mind simply overlooked it. She forced herself to focus, her eyes wide with a new, even more profound dread. The words blurred, then sharpened, cutting through the fog of her panic with an icy clarity. Only those who witnessed the last night will truly see what they are. Not the dead, but the vanished ones of the town. Ha skidded to a halt, her breath catching in her throat, the words searing into her brain. Not the dead, but the vanished ones. What did that mean? Her eyes frantically scanned the next line, the ink even fainter, as if the secret itself struggled to be revealed. The town buried them when they were still alive. The world tilted, the cemetery spun. Ha gasped, a dry, choked sound. Buried alive. The phrase echoed in her mind, a horrifying revelation that shattered every preconceived notion she had held. This was not a place of rest, not a haunted ground, but a prison, a living tomb. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision.
The unnamed graves, the number 23, the town's buried secret, the awake ones, the caretaker's desperate plea to hold them. These were not spirits, not phantoms. They were people. People who had been silenced, entombed, condemned to a living death by the very community they had belonged to. The figures pursuing her, the ones rising from the cracked earth, were not ghosts seeking vengeance. They were victims, finally breaking free from their century-long imprisonment. The town hadn't tried to conceal a crime of murder. It had tried to conceal a crime of live burial. The caretaker's final message resurfaced, the full weight of its meaning now crushing her. My duty is to keep them from leaving this consecrated ground. This wasn't about protecting the living from the dead. It was about protecting the town from the truth.
The 5 in section 23 were the ones who must remain forgotten, erased, not because they were dangerous in death, but because their existence, their brutal end, would expose a monstrous injustice. Ha's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. A long-forgotten epidemic, the town's history, the date on the journal, 1972, the 23-year cycle. It wasn't just a period of awakening, it was a morbid countdown. Every 23 years, their presence was felt, a faint echo of their torment. And this night, the last night, was their final, desperate chance for liberation, the last time the cycle would complete before their prison was destroyed. The town was about to obliterate the evidence of its heinous crime, but in doing so, it was inadvertently freeing the tormented souls it had tried to bury forever. The whispers behind her grew into a chorus of triumphant, dry rustling.
The chilling voice, the one that had spoken to her before, now echoed, closer, clearer, resonating from the depths of her soul. You know now, little bird. You see what they did. A macabre smile, invisible yet palpable, seemed to stretch across the invisible face of the figure closest to her. Ha could feel the ground trembling under her feet, a continuous, low vibration. From the direction of the 23 graves, the rasping groans had intensified into a chorus of desperate, strained sounds, like ancient chains breaking. The earth was churning faster now, the ground collapsing with more violent shudders. Whatever was down there was almost free, and as the realization settled, cold and sharp in her mind, a new, even more terrifying thought emerged. These vanished ones weren't just escaping their grave. They were coming for the town, for the descendants of those who had committed the unspeakable act. And she, Ha, was caught directly in their path, the sole witness to a truth that had been buried alive for generations, about to be unleashed. The truth, raw and brutal, was a fresh wound in Ha's mind. Buried alive, not once, but 5 times. The weight of the secret, carried by generations, was now pressing down on her, suffocating her with its implications. This was not a ghost story. It was a horror born of human cruelty, a testament to how far a community would go to preserve its reputation, to bury a terrible deed. The town of Anhwa wasn't just old, it was rotten at its core, its foundations built on lies and living graves. The figures surrounding her, no longer just shadows, seemed to solidify, their forms becoming more defined in the swirling fog. They were tall, gaunt, their limbs impossibly elongated, their heads tilted in an almost mocking posture. Still, their faces remained indistinct, blurred by the mist, as if their true features were too horrific to fully reveal.
Yet she could feel their triumphant energy, a chilling jubilation that resonated with the breaking ground behind them. They were almost free. Han knew, with a certainty that pierced through her remaining fear, that she had to warn someone. The town, the people. Her mind, reeling from the revelations, began to furiously search for a way out. The endless rows of graves still stretched before her, an impossible barrier. But if the cemetery had reshaped itself to trap her, perhaps it could reshape itself again. She clutched the journal, its pages now feeling like a burden, a cursed relic. This knowledge was too dangerous, too potent. A desperate primal scream tore from her throat, a sound swallowed instantly by the pervasive fog and the cacophony of groans from the 23 graves. It was a futile gesture, an echo of her helplessness. But the act of screaming, of fighting back, ignited a spark of defiance within her. She was a journalist. She wouldn't just be a victim.
She had to expose this, no matter the cost. She started running again, not towards any perceived exit, but simply away from the encroaching figures, away from the sounds of liberation. She zigzagged through the maze of headstones, her flashlight beam a frantic dance, her legs burning. Her camera, still slung across her shoulder, felt impossibly heavy, but she wouldn't abandon it. This story, horrifying as it was, had to be told. The truth had to come out. The wind bell, now right behind her, clanged incessantly, a frantic, desperate rhythm. The whispers of the figures formed a chilling chorus, no longer indecipherable, but almost a chant, weaving together in a dry, sibilant language she didn't understand, yet its meaning was clear. Freedom. Revenge. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shuddered violently. A deep, resonant crack split the air, louder than any before.
Ha stumbled, falling to her knees, her flashlight clattering to the ground, its beam spinning wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of her tormentors. When she looked back towards the 23 graves, the sight froze her blood. The 5 fissures were now gaping maw-like holes, and from them, slowly, deliberately, something was emerging. First, elongated, bony fingers, caked with wet earth, clawed their way out of the darkness. Then, skeletal arms, impossibly long, pulled upwards, followed by broad, stooped shoulders. The figures were not spectral, but horrifyingly corporeal, their forms starved and desiccated, their skin taut and papery, their limbs like gnarled branches. They were human once, but time and their horrific confinement had twisted them into something else entirely, something barely recognizable, yet intensely terrifying. Their heads, still shrouded in gloom, slowly lifted, and Ha could feel their vacant, ancient eyes lock onto her. They were free, all 5 of them. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if their long, dormant muscles were protesting their awakening. Yet there was an undeniable power in their deliberate resurrection. They were coming, not with the frenzied rush of madmen, but with the cold, methodical purpose of those who had waited centuries for their moment. Ha scrambled back to her feet, snatching up her flashlight. She could not outrun them, not truly. This wasn't about speed. It was about escaping a prison that had become sentient, a place that now actively sought to keep her in, or perhaps to make her join its ranks. She needed to break the illusion, to find the real boundary. She remembered the feeling of being watched when she first entered, the subtle feeling that had been dismissed as psychological. It wasn't just a feeling, it was the vanished ones greeting her, the gate that twisted on its hinges, the ground that shifted, the silence that enveloped the cemetery like a shroud. This place was alive, connected to the trapped souls within it. It had changed its shape, not physically, but through some ancient, unholy power tied to the beings now crawling from the earth. With a sudden burst of desperate clarity, Ha thought of the gate, the real gate. It had been solid, wrought iron. She closed her eyes for a split second, forcing herself to visualize it, to remember the exact texture, the cold feel of the metal. She focused on the memory, pushing against the encroaching fear, trying to conjure the image of the outside world, the familiar, comforting reality beyond this twisted nightmare.
When she opened her eyes, the endless rows of graves still stretched before her, but in the distance, barely visible through a momentary thinning of the fog, she thought she saw it. A faint outline, a glimmer of moonlight on wrought iron. Was it real? Or was her mind, desperate for escape, playing cruel tricks? She didn't have time to ponder.
The 5 desiccated figures from the 23rd graves, now fully upright, began to shuffle forward, their movements stiff, their gaunt forms radiating an intense cold that felt like death itself. The others, the shadowy pursuers, melted into the fog, their job done, their living counterparts now free to seek their retribution. Ha took a shaky breath, her lungs burning, and plunged towards the faint outline, a single desperate beacon in the shifting, terrifying landscape. She didn't know if it was real, or if she was running towards another illusion, another dead end. But she had to try. The town, Anhua, slumbered innocently just beyond this cursed ground, utterly oblivious to the ancient, buried horror that was now being unleashed upon its doorstep. And she, the unwitting witness, was the only one who could possibly warn them, if she made it out alive.
Ha ran as she had never run before, every muscle screaming in protest, every fiber of her being focused on that faint, shimmering outline in the distance. It was either salvation or the final, most cruel trick of this nightmarish cemetery. The air grew colder with each stride, the ground beneath her vibrating with a low, continuous hum, as if the entire earth was groaning under the weight of the released horror. Behind her, the shuffling footsteps of the awakened ones, no longer subtle whispers, but the distinct scrape of bone-thin limbs against the damp earth, grew louder. They were slow but relentless, an inescapable tide of ancient, starved vengeance. Her lungs burned, a fiery agony spreading through her chest, her vision blurred, tears stinging her eyes, tears of fear, of exhaustion, of the overwhelming dread that had become her constant companion. She stumbled, fell, scraped her knees on a sharp edge of stone, but scrambled back up without hesitation.
The journal, still clutched in her hand, was a heavy, damning weight, a chronicle of a town's darkest secret. She wouldn't drop it. This was the proof. This was the story that had to be told. The faint outline of the gate grew clearer, slowly, agonizingly, resolving into the familiar wrought iron bars, the ornate scrollwork, the rusted hinges. It was real. It was there. A desperate sob escaped her lips, a mixture of relief and renewed terror. The cemetery had finally, mercifully, chosen to release its grip. Or perhaps it no longer needed to, now that its true inhabitants were free. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Hop pushed through the remaining meters, her body screaming for rest. She reached the gate, her hands fumbling with the heavy latch, her fingers numb with cold. It clicked open with a rusty groan, a sound that, in this moment, was more beautiful than any symphony.
She burst through, stumbling out onto the gravel path just beyond the boundary, collapsing onto her hands and knees, gasping for breath, her body racked with tremors. The cold, crisp air outside the cemetery felt like a lifeline, a sudden, blessed reprieve. She lay there for a long moment, pressing her face into the cold gravel, sobbing, her entire being trembling with the aftermath of pure, unadulterated terror. Slowly, as her breathing began to even out, she pushed herself up, her limbs heavy and aching.
The eastern sky was already brightening, a faint pearlescent glow heralding the arrival of dawn. The dense fog, still clinging to the graveyard, was beginning to dissipate, revealing the familiar contours of the town, albeit still shrouded in a soft, ethereal mist. In the distance, she could hear the distinct rumble of heavy machinery, the clanking of metal, and the low murmur of voices. The demolition crew.
They were arriving, preparing to flatten this cursed ground, to bury its secrets deeper, completely unaware that the secrets had already unearthed themselves. A wave of urgency, cold and sharp, washed over her. She had to warn them. Ha turned, her body stiff and sore, to look back at the cemetery gate, to confront the place that had almost claimed her. And there they were, 5 figures, standing perfectly still, just inside the wrought iron archway, bathed in the pale, nascent light of dawn. They were no longer indistinct shadows or desiccated corpses. They were clearly visible now, their forms gaunt and unnaturally tall, their limbs elongated, but undeniably human in their spectral clarity. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, their eyes dark, fathomless pools. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent, triumphant phalanx. And they were smiling.
Not a warm, comforting smile, but a cold, knowing, utterly chilling grin that stretched their pale faces into grotesque masks of victory. Their smiles were wide, devoid of warmth or joy, filled instead with a malicious satisfaction, a terrifying promise of retribution. They looked at her, directly at her, their gazes piercing, acknowledging her as the sole witness to their liberation. Ha's blood ran cold once more, even colder than the pre-dawn air. She looked around frantically. A small truck was pulling up the road, its headlights cutting through the mist. 2 men in hard hats were getting out, yawning, stretching. They glanced at the cemetery, then at her, their expressions mildly curious at her disheveled state, but their eyes passed right over the 5 figures standing at the gate, seeing nothing. They saw only the old, empty cemetery, waiting to be raised. No one else saw them. The terror that had been momentarily quelled now returned with a vengeance, raw and absolute.
The 5 vanished ones, released, were invisible to the world. They had passed through the gate, into the dawn, into the town, unseen, unheard, ready to exact their vengeance on the descendants of those who had imprisoned them. Ha tried to scream, to warn the approaching worse, to alert the slumbering town. She opened her mouth, her throat raw and burning, her lungs heaving, but no sound came out, no warning, only a dry, rasping gasp. Her voice, like the truth she carried, had been stolen, choked by the terror, by the cold, triumphant gaze of the 5 figures, now slowly, silently, moving past the gate, dissolving into the mist-shrouded path leading into Anhua. They were free, and the town, blissfully unaware, was about to pay the price for a century-old sin. Ha stood there, utterly helpless, the sole silent witness to the dawn of a new, terrible reckoning.